All right, let's take a trip way back in time. Imagine it's 4,500 years ago, and two incredible superpowers are rising. Both are building these amazing societies along mighty rivers. But, and this is the crazy part, they could not be more different. We're about to see how one became a name everyone knows, while the other, which was arguably even bigger, is still one of history's greatest puzzles. So it all comes down to this, right? How do you build an empire? But even more than that, how do you get it to stick around? That's the million-dollar question. And believe me, we're going to find some fascinating and wildly different answers by putting two ancient giants side by side. The powerhouse we all know, Egypt, and the vast, mysterious civilization of the Indus Valley. Okay, picture the world around 2500 BCE. Now, we all think of Egypt and Mesopotamia as, the big players on the world stage. But there was a third superpower that was thriving, and it was actually more widespread than either of them. The Indus Valley civilization was, by sheer land area, the biggest of them all. And chances are you haven't heard nearly as much about it. Get a load of this number, 1,600 kilometers. That's about 1,000 miles. This was the distance between the most far-flung settlements of the Indus people. It stretched all the way from the Arabian Sea to the foothills of the Himalayas. We're not talking about a little city-state here. This was a massive, interconnected world. Every great ancient civilization has a river at its very heart, and these two are no different. But the personality of their rivers, the Nile for Egypt and the Indus for, the Indus Valley, completely shaped their cultures, their whole outlook on life, and, ultimately their destinies. Now think about this for a second. For the Egyptians, the Nile was a total gift. Its annual flood was so predictable you could literally set your calendar by it. It was this gentle, reliable provider of life. The Indus, on the other hand, that thing was a beast. It gave life, for sure, but its floods could be violent, unpredictable, and totally destructive. And that single difference changes everything. To survive, the Indus people had to become absolute masters of control and engineering. And that basic difference in their environment, it led to completely different priorities. And you can see it written right there in their architecture, in the stone and brick they left behind. What they chose to build tells us everything we need to know about what they cared about most. So, in Egypt, the focus was all about the monumental, the epic, the metaphysical. They poured unbelievable resources into building for the gods, and of course for the pharaoh's journey into the next world. The pyramids of Giza weren't just fancy tombs. They were seen as eternal machines designed to make sure the king became immortal and that the cosmic order of the universe was preserved. But then you look at the Indus Valley, and the contrast is just staggering. You won't find any great pyramids, no lavish royal tombs. What you find instead is something that's arguably just as impressive: meticulously planned cities. Their greatest achievements were practical, built for the living. Things like huge granaries, public baths, and what looks like the world's very first urban sanitation system. And just to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, a city like Mohenjo-daro might have been home to over 40,000 people at its peak. This wasn't some sleepy little town. It was a bustling, highly organized metropolis, and it was thriving thousands of years before cities like Rome or Athens even existed. Okay, so this brings up a really fascinating question. With all this organization, who was in charge? Who was calling the shots? In Egypt, the answer is crystal clear. But in the Indus Valley, this is where the mystery really starts to get deep. In Egypt, it's easy. The pharaoh. He was a living god, an absolute monarch, and his face was stamped on everything. But in the Indus Valley, we find nobody. It's baffling. Archaeologists have found no palaces, no royal graves, no giant statues of kings. The leaders are like ghosts in the historical record. And here is the great paradox. Even with these ghost rulers, this civilization was unbelievably organized. Across that whole 1,000-mile expanse, they used standardized weights, measures, even the same size of bricks. Their trade was so well regulated, it reached all the way to Mesopotamia. All of this points to some kind of powerful central authority, but one that, for whatever reason, chose not to build giant monuments to itself. But maybe the single biggest difference between these two worlds, the one thing that can truly unlock a civilization's deepest secrets, is its writing. For centuries, Egyptian hieroglyphs were just as mysterious as any other ancient script. Nobody could read them. But then we found the Rosetta Stone. And because it had the same text written in 3 different scripts, including Greek, which we could read, scholars were finally able to crack the code. And just like that, after thousands of years of silence, ancient Egypt could speak to us again. And this, right here, changes everything. We can read Egypt's history, their myths, their love poems, even their shopping lists. But the Indus script, which we found on thousands of tiny stone seals, remains completely undeciphered. We have their words, but we can't read them. Their stories, their beliefs, their names, all of it is locked away. We can see their world, but we can't hear their voice. This fundamental gap in our knowledge really shapes how we understand their final chapters. All civilizations eventually decline, but these 2 giants met very, very different fates. So just look at this timeline. Around 1700 BCE, right as the entire Indus civilization is collapsing, Egypt is on the verge of its most glorious, most powerful phase, the New Kingdom. The Indus civilization lasted for maybe 1,000 years, give or take. Egypt, on the other hand, endured for over 3,000 years before finally being conquered by Rome. One just vanished, the other was eventually absorbed. This quote is just haunting. It's describing the end of Mohenjo-daro. So while there may have been some final, violent event, the great city was already in decline. People were building shoddy houses, there were signs of overcrowding. The system, whatever it was that held this huge civilization together for centuries, it just broke down, and its great cities were left to crumble. So in the end, we're left with 2 completely different legacies. Egypt leaves behind a story of divine kings, of monumental ambition, and, crucially, a history we can actually read. The Indus Valley leaves a tale of incredible civic order with no obvious rulers, of practical genius, and a deep, profound silence that fuels an enduring mystery. And that really brings us to a final thought. What can a civilization that left behind no boastful kings or readable stories still teach us about how to build a society? And when you really look at these 2 worlds, one totally obsessed with the afterlife and eternity, the other focused on the practicalities of city life, which one would you choose? Which world would you rather have lived in?